Hi, welcome to Minerva, and today we're going to do a sew along on the True Bias Rio Ringer t-shirt and dress. I'm Sandy, your instructor, and we're going to make this cute little knit dress, and I'm going to take you through each step one piece at a time. We made this dress out of this really nice jersey knit fabric, and by the way, don't worry about writing everything down. We'll have all of the information in the document attached to the video for fabric choices and pattern numbers and everything you need to make your dress complete. So we use this really cute, nice, good weight bottle green jersey, which is perfect for a dress. The pattern will work with something more lightweight and t-shirt like, but for something that's going to be a little more substantial, this jersey works really well. And then we also used a ribbing fabric. This is a traditional ribbing fabric in a cream for the sleeves and the neckline to offset the green and give it a real t-shirt look. So it's very casual and it's perfect with a pair of flats. If you're heading out the door and the weather's nice, throw on a jacket and some boots and tights, and in the wintertime you will look absolutely smashing. It will be fabulous. By the way, I wanted to mention this dress that I'm wearing is the ebony tee from Closet Core Patterns, and there's also a sew along on that, and the information is also included in the document attached to this video. A couple of things you're going to need besides your fabric and your pattern. You're going to need some sewing needles for your machine. You want jersey needles. These needles will help your machine glide through a knit fabric a lot easier than a standard needle will, and it's going to make your knits so much, give them such a better seam. You're going to be much happier with them in the long run. If you just replace your regular needle with the jersey needle, it's a simple task, and you can just check your manual. Usually you just unscrew it and take the other needle out and slide this one back up and screw it in. You are going to be so much happier. Now with this dress, you don't need to use an overlocker. It's made and designed for someone that doesn't have a serger or an overlocker, and it's made to go on a traditional sewing machine. They're using a zigzag stitch and also a stretch knit stitch. So if your machine has one or both of those, you can do this on a regular machine. That's why jersey needle is so important. It's going to make your garment go up so much faster and easier. And of course, the other thing you need is a really good thread. We have Gutermann's. We have it in a bottle green and a cream, because you want to make sure that whether it's in the top or the bobbin, that you match the thread to the color of the fabric that's going through the machine at that point. So sometimes we have green in both and cream in both, and sometimes we mix them up a little depending on what seams we're sewing. And that's pretty much all there is to the intro. We are going to get started sewing our Rio Ringer t-shirt dress. All right, today we are going to sew this Rio Ringer t-shirt dress from True Bias on the machine, and we're going to talk about sewing jerseys and the best way to put them together with a traditional machine. If you have a serger or an overlocker, certainly that's a wonderful way to get the project going, but today we're going to use the machine. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you have your threads. We have some beautiful Gutermann threads here that are going to match our fabrics perfectly. So we have this bottle green fashion fabric for the main portion of the garment and the bottle green thread, and then also we need a creamy white thread to match our ribbing, our creamy white ribbing, because you want to make sure that you have the right threads in the upper and lower loopers as you go through the project. Now we are going to change a needle on our machine and put a jersey needle in. That is the single most important thing you can do to make your knit sewing absolutely fabulous on your machine. So we're going to use a knit stitch on this machine because it has one, and you should check your manuals to see if you have one on your machine. Obviously, if you had a serger or an overlocker, that would work perfectly well. But for this scenario, we're going to use the knit stitch on the machine. Alternatively, you could use a very narrow zigzag. The goal is to make sure that after you're finished sewing your garment, that the garment has some stretch. You don't want to use a traditional straight stitch, because when you stretch it, the stitches will pop. So you need to have some give so your fabric moves back and forth, because we don't want to pop a stitch as we are sitting down. That would be sad. So now we're going to look at the manual, and there's a couple of things that you want to look at when you open up the instructions. You want to check to make sure that what the seam allowance is, and in this case it's 3/8 of an inch, so that
tells us how big the seam allowance is when we sew our garment. The next thing we want to look at is the color of the diagrams, and the dark and the light. In this case, the dark is the right side of the fabric and the light is the wrong side of the fabric, and that makes a huge difference in the layout when you're looking at the drawings and the illustrations. It will help you determine which way you're actually going to sew some pieces together, so that's important. The other thing we want to look at is the stretch, and this is a stretch bar or a stretch indicator on your machine, and this gray portion is the portion of the fabric that when the fabric hasn't been stretched. So we're going to take a piece of our bottle green fashion fabric and we're going to lay it against that gray bar without stretching it. And then we want it to stretch it to that first mark where it says fashion fabric. And that indicates how much stretch you should have in your fabric so that you can make the garment the way the designer intended it to make. We're going to do the same thing with the ribbing, except the ribbing is going to stretch all the way to the right. It's going to have a much bigger stretch because we're making that smaller, and it's ribbing. It's meant to hold things in and make the garment nice and smooth. So using that stretch guide is very important to the success of your garment. So we are going to get ready to move forward and start sewing. The first thing that the instructions tell us to do is make sure we mark all our pieces, and certainly that is very important. We want to make sure that all our pieces and our notches are marked so that they go together perfectly without any issues. And we think that, and we know that this pattern goes together really well, so that's something that's important, that you line up all your marks. So the first thing we're going to do is prepare our ribbing. We're going to take our ribbing and we're going to fold it in half, wrong sides together, and press a crease in it. And then we're going to press 1/4 inch seam allowance down on the other side, and that will actually help us encase the garment, the seam allowance in the garment when we finish off the edge of the binding. All right, so we want to do that for both arm pieces, arm bands, and also the neckband. Now we're going to take our sleeve and add the ribbing to it. That's the next step. So we're going to take our pre-cut sleeve and put it right side up. Now when you're doing this, make sure that you have mirror images of the sleeves, because the sleeves have different sides. There's a front and a back to each sleeve. So we're going to put the sleeve right side up, and then we are going to take our binding and we're going to attach that to the sleeve right sides together like we do traditionally. Now the first thing that we want to do is we want to find the center of the bottom of our sleeve piece. So we're going to fold it in half, matching the edges. I'm just going to stick a little pin in there, and that will mark the center. That'll give us a better gauge to pin the pieces together. We're going to do the same process with the binding or the ribbing. We're going to fold that in half and find the center and stick a little pin in there. All right, now we are going to attach our ribbing to our sleeve hem. So we want to put the right side of the ribbing against the right side of the sleeve, and we're going to match up that center pin and secure those. So we're going to open it up so that fold and the edge that has the 1/4 inch, that's going to encase the sleeve seam allowance when we have finished sewing. So right now we're going to push that out of the way and we're going to pin that center, and then we're going to go over to the edge and we're going to pin one side of the sleeve seam, and then we're going to pin the other side, matching the edges of the bottle green fabric and the ribbing. All right, now you can see what we've done is we've created these gaps in between the ribbing and the sleeve, because the sleeve is actually bigger than the ribbing, because we want the ribbing to kind of suck in the sleeve. It'll do that around the neckline and it'll do it around the sleeve, and it gives it a really nice fit. So in order to do that, the ribbing needs to stretch to the same length as the sleeve hem. So we don't want to stretch the bottle green fabric, but we do want to stretch the ribbing. So now that we've divided this ribbing in half, we probably want to go into quarters and maybe even eighths, depending on how comfortable you are stretching your fabric at the machine. But what you want to do is find the center of each section and just keep pinning it so you pick up some of that extra fabric. This way, when you're stretching it in the machine, you're only stretching a small section at a time. You're not stretching the whole piece to get it to fit. Now that's really key. There. So I've done half of it, and we're going to go ahead and do the other half. One of the things that you want to consider is that the thread matches the fabric. So we are going to put this in so the sleeve is at the bottom of the machine, because the feed dogs will move that sleeve, which is a bigger piece, faster than the presser foot will move the ribbing at the top. So it will help gather that in. So in that case, I want to make sure that I have the creamy white thread in the top of my machine, and then also in the bobbin I have the bottle green bobbin thread, and that way it will match when I stitch it. So that will make a huge difference in the way that my finished garment is going to look. Now check your manual on your machine, because there are several options that you may have for stretch stitches. On this machine, I have a stretch stitch, which is a multiple stitch, and it goes over and over 2 or 3 times in the same spot. And that gives the fabric the opportunity to move back and forth. Another option is to use a stepped zigzag or a very narrow zigzag stitch, which will allow your fabric to stretch after the seam has been sewn, because that's really important. You don't want your stretches to pop. So those are 2 very good alternatives for people that don't have an overlocker or a serger to use as you are stitching your machine. If you are sewing along with me, I would like you to kind of move through the next few frames of the sew along video to determine which way you would like to apply your ribbing. Initially I used the technique that's used in the instructions, which would work really well for pretty much any kind of fabric. But since this jersey is a very hefty knit and the ribbing is fairly hefty, it was too much for my machine, and it just didn't come out very pleasant. So what I did was I've done several options, and I'd like you to explore both of them. Practicing on scrap fabric is certainly an important way to take a look and see which method is actually going to work best for your fabric and your machine. All right, we're going to explore the first method, which is the method that's in the instructions, and it works perfectly well. You can see that I have stitched on my bands on both of them. I've ironed the one at the top, and I have not ironed this one down here at the bottom, and you can see the difference. Pressing makes all the difference in the world, and it's going to help you as you move forward. The other thing I want to mention is that you need to make sure you know which sleeve is the left and which sleeve is the right, so marking is extremely important. This sleeve is not symmetrical. You can see there is a slight growth on one side of the sleeve, which gives you some ease in the garment and towards the back. That is the back of the sleeve, so I think that you need to be very careful about the right side of what garment you have as you are stitching them. So you certainly don't want to have 2 left sleeves. That would not work, or 2 right sleeves. Now we're going to encase our seam allowance in our sleeve band. So you want to make sure that the seam allowance is pressed towards the casing, and we're going to fold that casing back on the original fold line, and then the 1/4 inch is going to fold down and encase all of those raw seams. We're going to pin them very carefully, and one of the things that you need to make absolutely sure of is that they're even on the front. That is the most important, that measurement across the front where that pin is the same all the way around the band and on both sleeve bands, that they match. So if one section is 5/8 of an inch and the next section is 1 inch or 1 1/4 inches, you're going to have a sleeve band that's going to look uneven, and it's not going to be very attractive. So this is key. You go to the ironing board with your measuring tape or your ruler and your pins, and make sure that you iron this and pin it so it's absolutely perfect on the depth all the way around. All right, you can see that I have my left and right sleeve measured, pinned, pressed. Everything is ready to go in the machine, and I can tell already that it's a little thick, and it's probably going to be a struggle for my machine to go through. but we're going to give it a try and see how it goes and see what it looks like. I have cream thread in the upper and the bottom of my machine because I'm going to be stitching on the cream right near the edge with a narrow zigzag, and that's going to help hold that ribbing on, but also give it some stretch. And this is the recommended method on the pattern instructions. All right, I've stitched this on the machine with a narrow zigzag, and you can see that it's stretchy. However, it's not very pretty. There was so much fabric, it was shoving the fabric off to one side. My machine just couldn't handle all of that fabric going through it, and I'm just very unhappy with the way that that came out. Now, with a regular jersey t-shirt and some jersey ribbing, it would look perfectly fine, but since there is 2 layers of fabric in the seam allowance and then the fabric on the ribbing, it adds up to quite a bit of fabric, so the machine just couldn't handle it. So I'm going to take it out and we're going to try a different method. Now here is the second method that I mentioned to you, and that looks so beautiful. There's no rumpling, it still has stretch, the zigzag looks attractive, it's actually a style feature. And what I did was I unfolded that 1/4 of an inch. Instead of folding that back down on itself, it eliminated a whole layer of fabric, which allowed my machine to actually function properly and give me this beautiful zigzag stitch that looks smooth and attractive, and it looks like a style feature, which is exactly what it's meant to be. So this is a good alternative for you if your machine is struggling. Now you can trim that off or you can leave it. I don't think it's going to cause any issues, especially since it's a knit, it's not going to unravel. But that is a much nicer sleeve. You are going to be so much happier. So things like this happen as you're creating projects and creating garments, and you just need to experiment and try different things. And when something doesn't work, you need to take it away. Look at the difference between those two. The top one is the first one that I did, and it was all rumply and unattractive. And the bottom one is just absolutely smooth and beautiful. So I'm going to rip that first one out and make it the same as the second one, so my sleeves will be gorgeous. All right, we are going to sew the shoulder seam together. We're going to sew one shoulder seam. So we've taken the back and we've laid it right side up, and now we're taking the front and we're going to lay that right side up. And I like to have my pieces laid out in front of me so I can see exactly what we're doing. Now the instructions say that we're going to sew the left shoulder seam together. So since I know that both of my pieces are facing up, this is my left shoulder seam, and so I know that I'm on the right track. I'm just going to pin these together and stitch them up really quickly. All right, here we are with our garment right side up. We have our left shoulder seam sewn, and we want to prepare the garment for adding the ribbing around the neckline. So just like the ribbing that went around the sleeve, it's smaller than the opening. So we need to evenly distribute the ribbing around the neckline. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide the neckline into quarters, and we're going to divide the ribbing into quarters, and then we're going to match up each quarter, and that will give us a balanced neckline. Now we're going to start with the raw edges of the right shoulder that haven't been finished, and we're going to match up or walk our raw edge neck edge seams against each other all the way across until we get to the halfway point. We can't use a shoulder in this instance because the neckline curve on the back of the neckline is shorter than the neckline curve in the front. So what that does is that creates a longer dimension in the front. So by walking across the neckline, we reach the halfway point of our neckline, which is not our shoulder seam. So we're going to put a pin in this spot that we stopped at. And now when we open it up, you can see that the shoulder seam and the center point are very different. And that would make a huge difference if you were trying to jam in that ribbing and try to make it fit when actually you're going to be off quite a bit. So now what we're going to do, the next step is to do the same thing for quarters. So we're going to take the raw edge and match it up to the pin. right? Because that's 1/2 of the garment to find the quarter, and we're going to walk the edges all the way around until we get to the fold and put a pin in there, and then do the same thing for the other raw edge. We're going to take the other raw edge and match it up to the pin. And then again, walk our neckline raw edges next to each other until we come up to the other quarter. And now our neckline is divided into 4 equal pieces. That gives us a gauge so we can have a balanced gathering of the neckline against the ribbing. All right, next step is to divide up the ribbing. We're going to do that. That's very simple. We're going to fold our ribbing in half and put a pin in the center. And then we're going to fold each end of the ribbing to the center pin, and that will give us our quadrants or quarters to correspond to the neck edge. And you can see just by looking at it that it's quite a bit smaller than the neck opening, so you can understand why we want to make sure that we evenly space and balance, because it would just create rumples and all kinds of issues if we didn't space these out evenly, which is really important to make sure that that neck edge just sucks in really pretty and lays against your skin exactly the way that they want it to, and it needs to be balanced in order to do that. So now we're just going to pin this on. It's a simple process. We start at the raw edge of the right shoulder and we pin the ribbing to that raw edge, and then we match the quadrant pins. So we have that first pin and we're going to match that to the next, to the quadrant pin on the neckline. And then we're going to go all the way around and do each of the subsequent pins. So this is actually the second pin, and then we're going to go to the third quadrant and match up those pins. In this way, you know you have a nice balanced neckline. I mean, think about that. That's the part that frames your face. You want that to be absolutely perfection, the best you can get it, right? And then we finish up with the last raw edge. We pin that together nice and even. All right, so now you can see just like you had on the sleeve, there's gapping, and what we want to do is space out that gapping all the way across evenly so we have a nice even based ribbing around the neck. All right, now you can see that we've done this absolutely gorgeous ribbing, again, just like we did with the sleeves. And I opened up that back fold, so I got a beautiful stitch on it. Once it's pressed, it's going to be absolutely lovely, and the neckband looks terrific. It's got a really interesting look to it, so I'm very happy with that. Now the next step is pretty simple. What we're going to do is we're going to sew that open shoulder seam together. You want to make sure that you match up the edges very carefully. Those where the white and the green come together is a real important spot to make sure that those match up perfectly, because you're going to see that it's on your shoulder. So that's going to be a critical juncture. You can put a pin in there. If you're really uncomfortable about having that much fabric go through your machine, you can hand stitch it. And you want to sew the ribbing with white in your machine and then stop and then go back and finish the rest of the shoulder with the bottle green to give you an absolutely perfect looking seam. All right, we've stitched our seam, our shoulder seam closed, and we have now these flanges that we want to take care of. We're going to press the seam open, and then there's this little bitty edges right, that we don't want to hang over the folded edge of our band. So we want to just tack them down, give them a good tack back and forth with the machine. And then I just went through with my scissors and I clipped off those little edges, so I kind of angled them out. So you don't have these seam flanges floating around annoying you, because they just don't look very attractive. And you're going to do the same thing to the sleeve when you finish the sleeve band. All right, our shoulder seam is sewn together, and now we get to put on the sleeves. Our garment is really starting to take shape. And one of the fun things about this garment is that when you kind of finish, you're pretty much finished, because the neckline's finished, the sleeve hems are finished. You just have to finish the bottom hem of the dress. So we're very close. Now we're going to put our sleeve in with a flat method, which works for knit garments, and we really want to make sure that our garment is facing up and that we have the right sleeve for the right side. So remember, we mentioned that some sleeves in this garment, there is a right and a front and a back, so we want to make sure that our notches match up correctly. And I like to do that by having everything facing up on my board. All right, so now I know that I have the correct sleeve on the correct side. Okay, so now I'm going to find the notch at the top of my sleeve, and I'm going to match that notch to the top of my shoulder seam. Right, so they're all right sides up, so we know that everything is going to be good. We're not going to have any issues, right, when we sew these together. So we're going to flip our sleeve over and pin it, and we're going to pin it from the garment body side as opposed to the sleeve side, because we want to keep the sleeve at the bottom when we stitch it, because the feed dogs will help move that extra fabric through the machine as we're stitching it. And you know, there's a little bit of ease in the sleeve, so that is an important consideration. All right, I've added 2 pins to my seam allowance because I want to make sure that my seam allowances stay flat as I'm stitching them. And now I am going to take the end of my sleeve and I'm going to attach it to the edge of my side seam. We're going to pin that really carefully. We want to make sure that you don't catch anything in there that you're not supposed to catch. And we need to take our time when we're pinning knits, particularly on a sleeve, because we have a convex and a concave. And then we're going to match up the notches and then throw a couple of extra pins in there, because knits sometimes tend to roll, and we don't want to change the structure or the size of our garment by taking in too big of a seam allowance. Right? We also need to make very sure that that edge is exactly where it's supposed to be. So take a check at it, go back and look, and now we've pinned to the notch, and that's a 1-to-1 ratio, because we don't need that extra underneath our arm. But now we come to a convex and a concave seam, and this is where pinning from the garment side helps. And it's just a matter of kind of fingering your way along. This pattern is really well drafted, and the sleeve fits in there beautifully. So all you need to do is just take your time and match up the edges. And you don't even need to do a lot of maneuvering. It actually goes together beautifully. There, look at that. So the only thing you need to make sure is that when you sew it, you don't get any rumples or wrinkles, and you are good to go. Our sleeves are in, and they look absolutely gorgeous. They fit in so beautifully. There's nothing like putting in a sleeve on a flat edge. It certainly makes all the difference in the world. It's so easy to do, and it's a little scary at first, but once you've done it, it's absolutely going to be your favorite way to put in sleeves forever and ever with a knit garment. Fortunately, it doesn't work that way with a woven, but certainly with a knit, it's the best way to put in a sleeve for sure. All right, we are ready to do our side seam. So we are going to turn our dress right sides together, and we're going to start pinning this dress at the bottom. And this is a very long expanse of knit, and we want to make sure that we don't lose control of it and have the bottom get shorter than the top piece. So we want to pin the garment fairly well, partly because it is a knit and it's going to roll, and partly because we don't want it to change length, because we know that it's the right length because we've cut it out. So we're going to start with a pin at the hemline and make sure that is nice and even, and then we're going to go up to the underarm and we're going to pin the underarm section. So as we pin this underarm section, we want to make sure that we get a pin right where the sleeve comes in line with the side seam, and then we're going to take that length, that whole side seam, which is pretty long, and make sure that our fabric is unrolled and that it's nice edge to edge, and we're going to pin it all the way down. I probably would put pins every 6 to 8 inches just to be on the safe side. All right, so we have all of our side pinned, and now we're going to pin that little edge, and we're going to take the same care that we took when we were doing the shoulder seam. We're going to make sure that we match up the edges of the binding, and we're going to also make sure we match up the edges where they come together so we have a beautiful seam. And then we're going to sew the top part with the white thread and then the rest of it with green, and that's going to give us an absolutely beautiful seam to finish up pretty much what's left of the garment. After this, the only thing we have left to do is the hem.